Saskia drops her water bottle onto the bench, and then she crosses the empty training room floor and stops directly in front of me with nothing between us and the full weight of 5 seasons and 12 weeks in her face. My back is to the wall and I did not choose that position, but I do not move away from it. There is approximately 18 inches of air between the front of her training top and the front of mine, and I am aware of this distance the way I am aware of distances on the pitch, as a tactical fact that is also something else. She says, 5 seasons, and you still don't know what I do after the second faint. Then quieter. You were looking at my face. The inside of my forearms goes warm. Not from the session. If you want to hear uncensored too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you're watching from and subscribe. 5 seasons ago, I was 25 years old and newly promoted to the first team starting lineup for the club I had trained with since I was 17. And the first thing anyone in the league had said to me about the upcoming season was some version of, "Watch Saskia Voss." She had been the league's most consistent attacking midfielder for 4 years by then, the kind of player that other teams built their defensive formations around, not because she was the fastest or the strongest, but because she thought 2 moves ahead of everyone on the pitch and her body did not betray her thinking. I had watched footage. I had watched a lot of footage. I had told myself this was standard professional preparation. Our first encounter happened in the second half of a league match in October, my first full season. She had the ball at the top of the opposition's half, and I was the closest defender, which was not my position, but our central midfielder had gone down, and I was the nearest body, and I went for the ball the way I went for everything that season, which was fast and without enough information. She feinted left, which I read. She feinted right, which I also read. And then she did a third thing that I had no classification for. A half-beat pause that was not in any of the footage I had watched, and she was past me before my weight had finished shifting, and she had scored inside the following 8 seconds. I replayed it 6 times that week. I told myself I was learning her patterns. The second season, I held my record against her to 3 for 4 in our encounters, meaning I won the ball 3 times out of 4 on-field contacts, which was the best anyone in our league had done against her that year. The third season, she adjusted something in her approach, and it went back to 2 for 4. By the 4th season, we had been playing against each other long enough that the sports press had noticed. There were match previews that included our specific head-to-head statistical record as a narrative, a rivalry that had its own tracking column in 3 of the major sports outlets. I read all of them. I also told myself this was standard engagement with professional analysis. The 5th season, she tore her hamstring in the 3rd league match of the campaign, and I spent the remaining 40 weeks of that season with a specific quality of absence on the pitch that I chose not to examine and successfully did not examine for approximately 6 months until I arrived at the Northfield Sports Medicine Center 8 weeks ago with a grade 2 soft tissue tear in my left ankle and found Saskia Voss at the check-in desk with a printed rehabilitation schedule and a hamstring recovery program, and the specificity of the problem had, as they say, clarified. She had looked at me across the reception desk. I had looked at her. The sports medicine coordinator, a small, extremely organized woman named Priya, who would prove to be the most precise person I had ever encountered in a medical setting, had looked between us and said, "You're both on the 6-week modified program, which runs 10 to 12 and 2 to 4. You'll be sharing the main rehabilitation room for most of it. I assume you know each other." Saskia had said, "We've met." I had said nothing, which was also a kind of answer. That had been week 1. This is week 12, the last evening, and the training room is empty, and she is standing 18 inches from me, and I have managed the preceding 12 weeks with the same precision I bring to the pitch, which has not, in the end, worked. The injury modification chart went up on the wall of the rehabilitation room on the 3rd day. Priya printed it fresh every week. It was a full-color grid, each athlete's name down the left margin, each exercise across the top. The progress markers updated in different colored ink. From week 1, Saskia's name and my name had been directly adjacent on the left margin, which was alphabetical. Miller, S, and Muller, L. The double coincidence of that, the near-identical spelling of our surnames that had been a minor recurring joke in the press for 2 seasons, now made literal on a printed rehabilitation chart in a sports medicine facility in the middle of November. Priya had pointed to the chart on day 3 and said, "You'll notice you're on almost identical sequences this week. Saskia's hamstring protocol and Lena's ankle protocol share about 70% of their rehabilitation structure. I'm going to be honest with you both. This is the most efficient use of the room and the equipment, and it means you'll be working the same sequences in close proximity for most sessions. If this is going to be a problem, tell me now and I'll restructure. Saskia had looked at the chart and then at me and said, "It's not a problem." I had said, "It's fine." Neither of these things had been true. The first session had been polite and precise and professionally correct in every technical sense. We had warmed up on adjacent equipment, stationary bikes, a neutral starting point that required no interaction, and moved through the early sequences with the careful distance of two athletes who are used to sharing professional space and know the boundaries of it. Saskia's physio, Marta, had run her through the hamstring protocol. My physio, Dev, had walked me through the ankle mobility work. There had been perhaps 4 feet between us for most of it, which was professional and fine. The partner-assisted stretching sequence came at the end of the first session, at 52 minutes. Dev had explained it to me in the initial consultation. The shoulder and upper body flexibility work that accompanied the ankle protocol was most effective, with a partner providing light resistance, allowing the athlete to work against a stable point, rather than against her own body weight. This was standard. It was also the sequence that brought whoever was assisting to a position approximately shoulder width from the athlete, one hand placed at the shoulder blade, one at the opposing shoulder, a hold of 30 seconds. Dev was running 2 other patients on Tuesdays. Marta was the same. They had discussed it and decided, practically, efficiently, that the most sensible arrangement was for Saskia and me to assist each other with the partner stretches, since we were on adjacent schedules and the sequences corresponded well enough. They had presented this to us on day 3, together, in the rehabilitation room with the chart on the wall. Saskia had said, "That works?" I had said, "Sure?" The first time her hand came to my shoulder, left shoulder blade, heel of the palm, the specific 30-second hold of the partner-assisted stretch. I was facing the window and she was behind me, and I was running through the ankle rotation at the same time, and I was absolutely not thinking about the temperature of her hand through the fabric of my training top, which was warmer than I had expected, which was entirely irrelevant to the rehabilitation program. I did not think about it afterward. I thought about it constantly afterward. The second session, same sequence, same position. Her hand at my shoulder blade, 30 seconds, then the switch. My hand at her shoulder blade. She was taller by perhaps 2 inches, which placed her shoulder at a slightly different angle than mine, which I had no reason to notice and noticed precisely. The specific quality of her stillness during the hold. She did not shift or adjust her weight. She simply stood and held, and I held against her resistance, and the 30 seconds was both a clinical duration and another kind of duration entirely. And I had been running statistical analysis on my own responses to Saskia Voss for 5 seasons, and it had never once been clinical. By week 3, I had stopped telling myself I wasn't tracking it. By week 5, I had organized what I knew into something like a catalog, which was her specific scent at the end of a session, something clean and faintly mineral, not cologne, the scent of someone whose body does not supplement its natural chemistry and does not need to, was different from her scent at the start of one, which was a fact I had no professional use for. The sound the resistance band made when she reached for it from the rack. A particular snap of elastic that I had heard 3 times a week for weeks, and that now lived in a specific register of my auditory memory. The way she moved through the rehabilitation room between sequences, not the performance of an athlete demonstrating ability, but the movement of someone who has lived entirely in her body for 20 years, and has no doubt about what it is capable of, even in the constraint of the recovery protocol. The specific quality of her gaze when she was watching me do the ankle mobility sequence, not clinical, not evaluative in the way that coaches evaluate, but a kind of attention that belonged to a different category and that she did not appear to adjust for the setting. Week 6, the press had discovered we were at the same facility. There had been a brief, contained media cycle. 2 rival clubs, 2 rival attacking players, same rehabilitation space, significant mutual rivalry statistics, that both clubs' communications teams had managed with the same response. Standard professional recovery, no further comment. Priya had mentioned it to us once, in the corridor, and said, "I've asked the front desk to redirect any press contact to the club's press officers directly. It shouldn't reach the training room." And then she had gone back to her office. Saskia had looked at me in the corridor and said, "Does it matter?" I had said, "No." That had also been only partially true. Week 8. The ankle was 60% recovered. The shoulder and upper body flexibility had improved significantly, which was a secondary benefit of the program and not the primary one. But Deb had noted it in the session review with the specific satisfaction of a physio seeing the work produce results. The partner-assisted stretching was now a 12-minute sequence at the end of every session, more complex than in the early weeks, incorporating the shoulder, the upper back, and a seated sequence that required the partner to be positioned in front and slightly to the side, one hand at the shoulder, one hand light at the upper arm, the athlete rotating against the resistance. The seated sequence brought us face to face, 18 inches, approximately, between her face and mine when she was assisting the forward rotation. Her hand at my shoulder, her hand light at my upper arm. The specific quality of her attention in the 12 inches between our faces, not evaluating, not assessing, something I had no professional vocabulary for. I did it 3 times a week. I had been doing it for 4 weeks. I had not located a category for it that satisfied me. Week 9, Thursday session, end of the partner sequence. She had assisted me through the forward rotation and I had straightened and she had stepped back. And I had turned to move to the next marker on the sequence chart and she had said, quietly, not directed at anything apparently, "You lead with your left shoulder when you're fatigued." I had stopped. "What?" "On the pitch. When you've been running at full intensity for 60 minutes, your left shoulder drops. It's a tell." I had looked at her. "You've been tracking my tells. For 5 seasons." We had stood there in the middle of the rehabilitation room for approximately 4 seconds, which is a long time in a space like that with a specific history like ours. And then I had said, "The pause before the third feint, that's yours." She had looked at me for another 2 seconds and then gone back to the sequence chart, and neither of us had said anything else for the rest of the session. But something had shifted in the specific quality of the room, a recalibration of something that had already been misaligned, and I had cataloged that shift the same way I had been cataloging everything else, precisely without examining what it meant in the provisional category of things I would address later. I had not addressed it later. The Tuesday of week 10, the partner stretch sequence had reached its most complex configuration. The last element was a standing assisted lateral rotation. The athlete stood, the partner placed one hand at the hip, one at the opposite shoulder, the athlete rotating against controlled resistance, 30 seconds, 3 repetitions. The placement required the assisting partner to be close. The distance was not the 18 inches of the earlier sequences. It was 8, perhaps 10 inches, close enough that the change in body warmth between the space at 12 inches and the space at 8 was a distinct and measurable shift. Saskia had been behind me for the first repetition, her hand at my hip, her hand at my shoulder, and the specific quality of warmth from her proximity. At a distance I could feel differently from all the previous distances, and I had held the rotation for the count of 30 and released and stepped away from her hands and said, "Good," in what I hoped was a neutral tone, and then gone to the schedule chart and stood in front of it for 10 seconds as if reading it, which I was not. She had said, from behind me, "Second repetition." "Yes," I had said. "I know." I had gone back. Her hands returned to the same positions. The warmth of her palm at my hip through the thin fabric of the training tights was a clean clinical fact that my body was cataloging with absolutely no clinical detachment whatsoever. The scent of her at 8 inches, the mineral clean end of session scent, which had been building through the 90 minutes, was specific and close, and she had not moved. I had held the rotation for the count of 30 and released and stepped back and turned around. She was looking at me. "Third repetition," she said. "I know," I said. "The third repetition." Her hands, the same positions, the back of my hip, the front of my shoulder, 8 inches. I counted 30 and did not rush it and did not slow it and stepped back. She let go precisely on 30. I did not say anything. She did not say anything. We had gone to our separate benches and collected our water bottles and finished the session in a professional silence that was so precisely calibrated, it required active maintenance from both of us, which was itself a form of information that I had been doing my best to file incorrectly for 10 weeks. Week 11. The sessions continued. The specific quality of the room had changed since the Tuesday of week 10, and we were both aware of this and had made a mutual, unspoken agreement to proceed as if we were not. I had done ankle mobility work. She had done hamstring protocol. We had run the partner stretch sequence at the end of every session with the same precision we had run it since week 1, and I had been aware of every variation in distance and duration, and the specific placement of her hands with the same thoroughness with which I had tracked her on-field patterns for 5 seasons. And I had been telling myself the same things I had been telling myself for those 5 seasons, which was that this level of attention was professional, appropriate, the natural result of extended shared space, in which I no longer believed in any register. The press cycle had briefly reinitiated in week 11. One of the sports outlets had published a feature piece on our respective injury recoveries, a comparative analysis of what both players' absence had cost their clubs in the season table and what their return would mean for the end-of-season run-in. They had included our head-to-head career statistics, which I had been consciously not looking at for 3 months and which were, objectively, a remarkable document of 2 athletes who had been the right shape of problem for each other for long enough that the problem had become definitional. I had read it once. I had put it away. I had gone back to the session. Thursday of week 11, the last session before the final week. Saskia had been running the hamstring strengthening circuit, a sequence of resistance band exercises that she ran with a specific economy of movement that I had been watching for 11 weeks and that I had completely stopped pretending to watch for any reason other than the actual reason. She had reached for the resistance band on the rack, the snap of elastic, the specific sound that had been in my auditory catalog for 3 months, and she had brought it through the circuit, and at the end she had come to stand at the bench where I was cooling down and she had said, "Tomorrow's the last Thursday session before clearance." I know. And next Thursday we're both cleared. Yes. She had looked at the injury chart on the wall. Both our names, side by side. 12 weeks of shared schedule, the progress markers in Priya's colored ink tracking the work from the first week's baseline to the current week's clearance approaching completion. She had looked at it for 2 seconds, and then she had looked at me and said, "Are you ready?" I had understood that she was asking about the ankle recovery. I had also understood that she was not only asking about the ankle recovery. I had said, "Yes." She had nodded once and gone back to the equipment rack, and neither of us had said anything else for the rest of that session. I had driven back to the flat I had rented near the facility and sat on the couch for 40 minutes without turning on a light, which was not something I generally did. And the specific quality of that 40 minutes was something I had also chosen not to examine. Tonight is Thursday. The facility closes at 8. Priya had run the final assessment at 4 o'clock, range of motion, strength benchmarks, functional movement patterns, and had signed off on both of us. Return to full training Monday. Return to match selection for the following weekend's fixture. Full clearance effective tomorrow. She had given us the formal documentation and said, "I'd normally say take tonight easy, but you're both professionals, so light warm down, session ends by 7:30, leave the facility tidy." She had looked between us in the specific way she had been looking between us since week 1, with the expression of a person who sees everything and is too professional to say most of it. And she had said, "It's been a very productive 12 weeks. We had both thanked her. She had gone home. The coordinator at the front desk had let us into the training room for the warm down at 6:15 and left at 6:45. At 6:45, the facility had become the specific quiet of a large institutional space, with no people in it except the 2 of us and the HVAC system and the last of the evening light through the high windows. I had done the ankle mobility work. Saskia had done the hamstring cool-down sequence. We had run through the warm down in the familiar order, the order that had become its own kind of knowledge in 12 weeks, which equipment, which sequence, which timing, and the room had the specific temperature of a space used hard for 90 minutes and now cooling, a body warmth that was both of ours and the room's and the accumulation of 12 weeks of this specific work. The partner stretch sequence, we had run through it in order. The shoulder sequence, the upper back, the seated forward rotation, face to face, 18 inches, her hands at my shoulder and upper arm, the familiar 30 seconds, 3 repetitions. I had looked at a point past her left ear for most of it, which was a coping strategy I had developed in week 8 and which had approximately 40% efficacy, which was not enough efficacy. The standing lateral rotation. Her behind me, her hand at my hip, her hand at my shoulder, 8 inches. The warmth of her proximity at that distance, clean, familiar. The mineral warm scent of the session, close enough that I could hear the slight change in the quality of her breathing between the first and third repetitions. Close enough that when she held the 30 count, she was very still, and the quality of her stillness at 8 inches was a different thing from her stillness at 18. 3 repetitions, 30 seconds each. I counted all 90 seconds with exact attention and said nothing. We had switched. Her forward rotation, my hands at her shoulder and upper arm, the seated sequence. Her rotating toward me, her face 18 inches from mine at the peak of the rotation. Her eyes going to some neutral point past my shoulder, the way my eyes went to a point past hers, and I was holding the resistance for the count of 30, and I was aware of her scent and the warmth of her and the specific quality of this last session's particular silence, which was different from the 11 previous Thursdays' silences in a way I could not have itemized but that my body understood precisely. Third repetition. She released and straightened. I dropped my hands. She did not step back. The sequence was complete. The protocol called for a step back, a transition to the bench, water, cool down complete. She had executed this sequence 43 times in 12 weeks with exact technical precision. She did not step back. She stood in the position of the third repetition, close enough that the space between us was not the space of the sequence completion, not the space of the bench transition. It was the space between the end of something and the beginning of something else, and neither of us was moving through it. My hands were at my sides. The inside of my forearms was warm in the way that had nothing to do with the session. She stepped back. One precise step. She went to the bench and picked up her water bottle, and I went to the bench and picked up mine. And we sat for the cool down in the specific silence of two people who have made a mutual, unspoken decision that they are going to address at a moment that is not yet this moment. The water bottles sat between us on the bench, hers dark gray, mine pale charcoal. The injury modification chart on the wall across from us, both our names, side by side, 12 weeks of shared schedule, Priya's colored progress markers, tracking the arc from week 1's baseline to tonight's clearance final session. I looked at it for a long time. I was aware of Saskia looking at it too, and then looking at me looking at it. I said, without planning to, "I never ran a tactical approach on you." She turned from the chart to look at me. The room was quiet. The HVAC, the distant sound of wind off the outside training pitch, the specific institutional quiet of the facility at 7 in the evening with no one else in it. "What?" she said. "In 5 seasons, the preparation files, I ran the standard team patterns, the general attacking analysis for our tactical opponents. I didn't build one specifically for you." I was looking at the chart still. The chart's 2 names. 5 seasons and 12 weeks, and an injury modification schedule that had put us in the same room 3 times a week for 100 days. Everyone expected me to. My coaches mentioned it. The analytics team had run a preliminary file and asked if I wanted the complete version. I looked at her. I didn't take it. She was looking at me with the particular quality of attention that was not evaluative in any clinical sense. The training room was the specific temperature of the evening cool-down. Not hot, not cold, the residual warmth of the session and the evening and the 12 weeks of this particular occupation. The light from the high windows was the last of the day's natural light, the overhead half-setting giving everything a precise, functional clarity. "Why?" she said. I considered several answers. I picked the one that was true. "Because it would have reduced you to a pattern." She was quiet for 4 seconds. Not the quiet of someone without an answer, the quiet of someone deciding what to do with one. Then she stood. She crossed the 3 meters of open floor between the bench and the equipment rack, and she lifted the resistance band from the rack. The familiar snap of elastic, the sound from my auditory catalog, the sound that now meant 12 weeks and 3 times per week, and something I had stopped filing in the clinical category in early November. And she held it for a moment without purpose, without beginning a sequence, just holding it. She said, without turning, "In the 3rd league match of the season, our first encounter, you read the first feint and the second one." She turned. No one in the league had read 2 consecutive feints from me that season. She was looking at me across the 3 meters. "I went back and watched the footage 4 times. I said, "I watched the sequence 6 times. "I know," she said. "Your coordinator told my coordinator during a scheduling conflict in season 2. They were comparing preparation methods." She set the resistance band back on the rack. "I have your full technical profile in a file that I have updated every season for 5 years. The room was very quiet. "Saskia," I said. She crossed the 3 meters of open floor and stopped 1 foot in front of me. 1 foot. Less than the standing lateral rotation distance. Less than any distance in the partner sequence protocol. The space between us was not a professional distance. It was not any distance I had a category for except the honest one, which I had been avoiding naming for 12 weeks and for 5 seasons before that, and which was the only category left. She said nothing. She stood there on the open training room floor, the equipment at the walls, the injury chart behind her with both our names, the 2 water bottles on the bench to our left, and she looked at me with the specific quality of attention that I had been cataloging since week 1, and that had never belonged to the clinical register. And she waited. The HVAC breathed. The wind moved off the outside pitch. The facility was empty. Tomorrow we were both cleared. I said, the first season, the second half sequence. When you did the third feint, the pause, I didn't read it. I met her eyes. I was watching your face. She did not move for 2 seconds. Then, which part? I said. Your mouth? She looked at me. The quality of the room changed in a way I could feel against my skin, a specific recalibration of whatever had been almost calibrated for 12 weeks and 5 seasons. And the inside of my forearms went warm in a way that the session had nothing to do with. She said, 5 seasons, and you still don't know what I do after the second feint. Then quieter, in a register she had never used in the training room and possibly had never used anywhere with me. You were looking at my face. The back of my shoulders met the wall. I had not moved there deliberately. I was there, and Saskia was standing between me and the open floor, 18 inches, which was not 18 inches anymore because she was not staying at 18 inches, and I was not moving away from the wall. Her hands moved first, both of them at once, not a sweep, not a dramatic gesture, a placement. The flat of her palms against my forearms, both forearms, the inside of them. A temperature I had now felt 43 times in partner sequence, and that was nothing like this, and exactly like this, and she held. Not moving. Placed. The warmth of her palms against the inside of my forearms, warmer than I had learned to expect from the partner sequences, or the same warmth but in a different context. And context is temperature. Context is pressure. Context is what it cost both of us to hold still during the preceding 12 weeks and the specific cost of holding still now, which was different because we were not holding still. She said, say it completely. The injury chart was on the wall behind her. Miller, S. And Meller, L, side by side, 12 weeks of adjacent schedule, the progress markers tracking the arc of 2 injuries and their rehabilitation, and one thing neither of us had filed with the club physio, and would not be filing with the club physio. One thing with no modification protocol and no clearance timeline, the thing that had been in the room every session since week 1, and that we had been, both of us, with the same thoroughness we brought to our respective professions, cataloging and deferring and preparing for in the way you prepare for something you cannot prepare for, which is to simply move toward it with full knowledge of what you are moving toward. Her hands were on my forearms, the inside of my forearms, the warmth of her palms held. I said, in 5 seasons I watched your face more than your feet, more than your hands, more than your hips, which are what you're supposed to watch. I watched what your face did before you committed to the direction. I met her eyes. It was more useful than anything in the analytical file would have been, and it also was not, in the end, about being useful. She was looking at me with both of us very still. Her palms had not moved. The warmth of the contact was the same warmth and also a different warmth. The warmth of something that had been building for 12 weeks and for 5 seasons, and that was now in the space between my skin and hers, at the specific interior surface of my forearms and her palms, and I was aware of the quality of her breathing at this distance, which was controlled and which was costing her to keep controlled, and I was aware of my own breathing, which I had stopped doing unconsciously and then consciously resumed. Why your face? She said. It was not a question. It was a sentence with specific gravity, a sentence that knew its own weight. I said, because I wanted to know what you looked like when you were deciding. She made no sound. The room made the sound of the HVAC, the sound of the last of the evening outside the high windows, the sound of 2 people standing 1 foot apart in an empty training room on the last evening before they returned to their separate clubs and their separate seasons. And there was a specific quality of silence in that room that was not absence. It was pressure. The accumulated pressure of 12 weeks and 5 seasons, and everything that had been in the room every session and never addressed, and was now completely, irreversibly addressed. Her thumbs moved. That was all. Both thumbs, at the same moment, pressing once against the inside of my forearms, at the soft place below the elbow. Once, held for 3 seconds, and then not released, but simply remaining. A weight that was not a weight, a contact that was not asking permission and was not demanding it either. That was simply declaring itself with the same economy of movement she brought to everything, with the same controlled precision that was not the absence of feeling, but the exact, deliberate management of it. A management that she was now, by the pressure of her thumbs at the inside of my forearms, choosing to set aside. I said, "I know what you look like when you're deciding." She looked at me. "You go very still," I said. "Everything stops except your eyes, and your eyes move to the thing you've decided on." Her eyes had not moved from my face since she had placed her hands on my forearms. I said, "You decided on this in week 1. She said, "Week 2. I said, "What happened in week 1? She said, "I decided it was a problem." A pause. "Week 2, I decided it was the kind of problem I was going to have regardless." I was standing with my back to the wall of the rehabilitation room, and Saskia Voss was standing 1 foot from me with both her hands on my forearms, and the injury chart was on the wall behind her, with both our names and 12 weeks of shared schedule. And the facility was empty, and we were cleared for return tomorrow, and I said, "And what are you deciding now?" She moved her hands, not away. She moved them, both palms, the full, warm surface of them, from the inside of my forearms to the back of them. A slow turn, and then up, following the line of my arms from forearm to elbow. The heel of her hands at the inside of my elbows for a moment, warm and still and not moving. And then continuing, up the outside of my arms to my shoulders. And she stood there at 1 foot, with both hands at my shoulders, not gripping, placed, and she looked at me in the way she had been looking at me since week 1, which was also the way she had been looking at me in 5 seasons of on-field encounters, and which I had been filing as professional attention because I had not been ready to file it as the actual thing. She said, "I'm deciding the same thing I decided in week 2. I said, "Which is?" "That I'm going to have this problem," she said, "and that I'm going to stop managing it as a problem." Her hands were at my shoulders. The warmth of her palms, familiar and not familiar, professional and not professional, 43 partner sequences, and none of them this. The scent of her at 1 foot in the end of session quiet. The mineral clean warmth of someone who has been in the room with you for 12 weeks. The specific quality of her proximity that was also specific and also hers, and also something I had stopped pretending to file in any neutral category in November. I put my hands on her forearms. She did not step back. She went very still, the specific stillness I had learned in 12 weeks and in 5 seasons before that, the stillness that preceded the decision, and I looked at her face, as I had been looking at it since the second half sequence in the first season of the league, as I had been looking at it in every on-field encounter and in every partner sequence and across every session in this room, at her face, which was the thing I had been watching, instead of her feet and instead of her hips, and that had been more useful than any analytical file. And that was, now, at 1 foot in the specific light of the training room at 7:15 on the last Thursday evening, showing me the decision, showing me exactly what it looked like. She moved 1 hand from my shoulder to my jaw, not gripping. 2 fingers below my ear, a placement, the angle of her hand asking for something without demanding it. And I turned my face toward her hand the way I had been doing things toward Saskia Voss for 5 seasons, which was against my better judgment and in full knowledge of the consequences. And she said, very quietly, in the register she had used once, briefly, in the hallway in week 9, the register that was not the training room's register and not the press conference's register, the register that was only hers and only here. "Lena," I said. "Yes," she said. "I know." And she kissed me. Not the way I had been managing the hypothetical of this for 12 weeks, which had involved a careful maintenance of the hypothetical's distance. She kissed me the way she played, which was with full intention and no excess, all of it directed at one precise outcome. And the outcome was this: the specific quality of her mouth against mine, the warmth of it, the pressure of it, that was not asking and was not demanding, but was doing what she had been deciding since week 2, which was stopping managing this as a problem. I kissed her back. The management of the hypothetical had not included this option's full sensory specification, and I was adjusting in real time, which I was capable of. I had been adjusting in real time to Saskia Voss's decisions for 5 seasons. And what I was adjusting to was the warmth of her hands, one at my shoulder and one still at my jaw, the specific temperature of her mouth, The way her stillness during the first half second resolved into something that was not stillness and was also not the absence of control, was instead its redirection from holding still to moving toward. And the distance between those two things was the distance of 12 weeks and 5 seasons. And a decision made in week 2 and maintained until tonight, which was the last evening. I put both hands at her waist. She made no sound. She moved closer, the foot of distance reducing to something that no longer had a unit of measurement I wanted to apply to it, and I was aware of her, of the full specific presence of her at this proximity, which was not a proximity from any sequence in the partner protocol, and not a proximity from any on-field encounter, and which was entirely its own thing, the thing she had been deciding for 12 weeks, the thing I had been watching her face to know when she would decide. She pulled back, not away, a breath of distance, a half inch, and she looked at me. At my face the way I looked at hers, which I now understood was the same thing from her direction, had been the same thing since the second half sequence in season 1, and the return fixture and the cup final, and every encounter in every season. Both of us watching each other's faces when we were supposed to be watching feet. Both of us building files that were not the analytical kind. She said, 5 seasons. I said, I know. She said, that's a long time to manage a problem. I said, you were very good at it. She was quiet for a moment. So were you. Her thumb moved, the heel of her hand at my jaw, her thumb at the edge of my cheekbone, one slow motion, unhurried, the kind of motion that had no training room context and no analytical file category, and that belonged entirely to what we were choosing right now. In this room, on this evening, with no press officers and no cameras, and the facility empty, and tomorrow's clearance making this the last night of the 12 weeks, and also the first of something with no modification protocol. I said, I watched your face in the second half sequence, because I couldn't watch anything else. She said, I know, I saw you watching. And you still scored. Yes. The quality of her voice had something in it that was close to what I would, in a different context, have called amusement. Except that it wasn't amusement, it was something warmer than that and more specific. I always score, she said. But I noticed you. We stood there in the training room with the equipment at the walls and the 2 water bottles on the bench and the injury chart on the wall behind Saskia with both our names, and the HVAC breathed, and the wind moved off the outside pitch, and the facility was entirely empty, and the evening light was the specific quality of the last of it through the high windows. And I was aware of her hands and my hands and the distance between us that was no longer being managed. I said, What do you tell your press officer? She said, Nothing. And then, What do you tell yours? Nothing, I said. Her hand moved from my jaw back to my shoulder, and she stood there with both hands at my shoulders and me with both hands at her waist, and we looked at each other the way we had been looking at each other for 5 seasons, with the specific honesty of 2 people who have been each other's best problem for long enough that the problem had become definitional, and who had discovered in 12 weeks of a rehabilitation schedule neither of them would have chosen, that what they had built in competition was also the most honest relationship either of them had. I said, Tomorrow we go back. Yes, she said. Separate clubs. Yes. And next time we're on the pitch together, the 34th minute, she said. Home fixture, 2 weeks from Saturday. It's from... She said it the way she said everything, with the precision of someone who had already computed it. And I understood that she had known the fixture date for at least as long as I had, which was since the schedule was published in August, and that she had been computing the distance of this in exactly the same way I had. You'll go for the second feint, I said. Yes. And the third. Yes. And I'll be watching your face. She looked at me, the warmth of her hands at my shoulders, the warmth of the room, the specific quality of the last evening's light, and the injury chart behind her with both our names and 12 weeks of a shared schedule that had fixed the injuries they were designed to fix and found something else entirely, something with no protocol and no modification chart and no clearance document, something both of us were going to carry back to our separate clubs tomorrow and that we were not going to report to anyone. She said, I know you will. She kissed me again. The same precision, the same full intention, and this time I did not adjust in real time. This time I simply was there, with her, in the training room that had been our room for 12 weeks, and that would go back to being a rehabilitation room in the morning. And I kissed her with the same thoroughness I had been bringing to the problem of Saskia Voss for 5 seasons, which was to say completely. At 7:40, we were sitting on the bench. Her training bag was on the floor beside mine, both our water bottles between us on the bench. The injury chart was still on the wall. It would be taken down in the morning by whatever staff set the room up for the next intake, and both our names would come off the chart, and our equipment assignments would be cleared, and the rehabilitation schedule that had put us in the same room on the same sequence for 12 weeks would cease to apply. I was looking at the chart. Both our names side by side, Muller, S, and Muller, L. Saskia was looking at it too. She said, "Priya's going to know." I said, "Priya has known since week 3. I thought about it. "Possibly week 2. She was quiet. Then, with the particular quality of restraint that I had learned, was her version of humor. "She's very professional." "She is," I said. "She signed off on us both today without commentary. That was professional courtesy." "Or evidence," I said, "that she has seen this before and has a standard protocol for not commenting on it." Saskia looked at me with the particular quality of attention that I had spent 12 weeks cataloging and that I was now looking at from a different angle, the angle of after, which was a different kind of attention than before, and which I was going to spend some time learning. She said, "I am going to beat you to that ball in the 34th minute." "No," I said, "you're not. The 3rd feint." "I've watched your face for 5 seasons," I said. "I know what the 3rd feint looks like." "You know what my face looks like," she said. "That's not the same as reading the feint." She was right, and we both knew she was right, and I also knew that she knew that it was no longer, in any sense, only about the feint. The 34th minute of the home fixture 2 weeks from Saturday was going to be a different kind of problem from all the previous encounters. One more variable added to the 5 seasons of variables. And it was going to be the most complicated and the most honest encounter we had run yet, and I was looking forward to it with the specific anticipatory feeling I had been looking forward to things involving Saskia Voss with for 5 seasons, which had also never been, in the end, only about the football. I said, "You're going to hesitate." She looked at me. "On the 3rd feint," I said, "for the first time in 5 seasons, half a beat." She was very still. I said, "Because you'll be watching my face too." She did not confirm it. She did not deny it. She looked at the injury chart on the wall with both our names, and then she looked at me. And she did the specific thing I had watched her face do for 5 seasons. The thing I had been watching instead of her feet. The thing I had been watching instead of her hips. The thing I could not have named for 5 seasons and that I now had a name for. Which was, she decided. Her hand found my wrist. Not gripping. A loose hold, the warmth of her palm below my hand, her fingers curled against the inside of my wrist without closing. Just there. Not leaving, not tightening, just there, the way the 2 water bottles were there, and the training bags were there, and the injury chart was there, the way everything accumulated in a room over 12 weeks of being consistently, specifically, professionally, in the same place at the same time, becomes evidence of the thing you were really doing. I looked at the chart. Muller, S. Muller, L. 12 weeks of forced proximity, 3 sessions per week, 43 partner sequences, 2 water bottles on a bench every evening, 1 resistance band on a rack, 1 injury chart on a wall. 2 athletes who had been each other's best problem for 5 seasons, arriving at a rehabilitation program they would not have chosen, and finding that the 12 weeks had fixed the injuries they'd arrived with and turned up something else entirely. Something with no protocol, no modification plan, no clearance document with Priya's signature, something neither of them had filed, and neither of them would file. Something both of them were going to carry back to their separate clubs, to their separate seasons, to the 34th minute of the home fixture 2 weeks from Saturday, and every minute after that, and every encounter on and off the pitch, which was going to be complicated and honest and a different kind of problem from all the previous ones. The right kind of problem. Her hand was on my wrist, loose and warm and not leaving.